What is up, everyone, and welcome back to another Lost Skies Skywatch update. It has been nearly a month and a half since the last Skywatch, and the devs have finally released their newest wave of Lost Skies content. We're now on the team's 21st public update of the game and its progress, so without wasting any time, let's just go ahead and get straight into the newest info on their progress. First thing the devs mention here is the last 6 weeks they've been putting together a big delivery for their official publishers, Humble Games. And at their current stage, they aren't adding any brand new featured assets, and instead are releasing what is effectively a polish update, while of course still sharing some of the new public info and more specifically, interesting visuals for some early bosses. And while I understand that this update isn't a ton of brand new assets and features, it nonetheless covers a large variety of quality of life improvements and background improvements that are both vital to the game and to its overall infrastructure. And starting with one of these big improvements, they mention Tom's work on a globally unified damage system, where they have created a base system that can be universally applied to all objects within the world, meaning anything can now damage anything. Where they provide an example of this by showing an in-game picture where a character is shooting a tree with a rifle. They mention that while the point here isn't that this will be more efficient than something like the saw blade that we've seen before, it more or less represents something that different players can use to opportunize and understand and learn and utilize different damage systems in different ways that you may not have once thought of. And on the UX front, Ellen is focused even more on the icons, and which will certainly be important to the new players, as clear and understandable icons both enhance the feeling of the game but also allow for a quicker and easier time starting to grasp the newer concepts, abilities, functions, and all the things that make up what a player can do without needing to give a detailed explanation for every individual thing. Where some of these icons she put together give depictions of what looks like different weapons, grappling hooks, hook abilities, different ship bags, storage functions, drones, ship modifications, and what even looks like some kind of gas bomb thing. Nonetheless, I think Ellen has done a fantastic job with the art and newer additions. The last thing Ellen has put together for the Skywatch is some boss enemy HUD, which this is actually the first Skywatch we are seeing where the devs are starting to release new content on their bosses. And Ellen here has done a great job for some of these depictions, where we have to mention again Forces of the Seraphs from a few Skywatches back, with mention names for Herald and one called Harbinger, where you can see even small depictions on the HUD of a flying ship through the clouds, and on the right a large being that's challenging that ship, all of which are getting me very excited for what the devs have in store for boss fights in the future. Next up, we have another addition to Region 2 assets, where they mention Claudia has been hard at work creating assets for the second area of the game, and that this is a massive project since she needs to effectively craft an area that feels like Lost Skies but is completely distinct from the first region. Her work is vital here since it helps ensure that future players will truly feel like they're exploring another part of the world of Lost Skies, where similar in style to the clip that was shared in the last Skywatch of worked on Region 2 assets, these new building structures follow a sort of block-like Aztec feel, almost sort of imitating kind of a Gothic accent as well. And while they haven't shared yet any info on what kind of in-game civilization might be hailed for having quote-unquote created this architecture from a story standpoint, it certainly could be tied to the Gaul civilization, who we've only heard just a little bit about, and as far as we know from an in-game story view, they were the ones behind many of the tools that the characters in Lost Skies will be using. And I think because we've only been told so little amounts about them as a society, it would make sense that they could be behind this second region or even a part of further regions later on in the game's development. The next item of mention for the Skywatch is shipbuilding. The devs state here that over the next 2 months, they're going to be focusing a large majority of their efforts on shipbuilding, parametric flight, and combat. And while all these systems already do exist in the game, after having a ton of feedback from playtesting, the team has come up with a big list of quality of life tweaks that they want to add. This video here shows some of the item rotation improvements, placement, and snapping among other fixes that they're working on, which will be a significant chunk of work, both to sift through all of the tiny specifics of what playtesters have shared, but also to the extent of implementing new changes to accompany them that ensure that the experience of the game actually does feel better than before. In the video here, it does do a good job of showing off the variety of optional placement in a test ship, where the player is able to toggle universal and directional placement even as he aims the object onto different kinds of angled and sloped walls. and even toggle grid-like placements as well, which would allow for more exact placement locations within your ship to ensure that, things have proper alignment as well. While Tony is working on those, Luke, the team's lead designer, has been looking at easing players into the shipbuilding process and breaking down progression steps for different stages of the game. As they explain, the shipyards will have different applicable levels, the first of which allows you to build 6 sections maximum of a fairly small ship, where you are able to see the screenshots is effectively an ant compared to the placeholder model of a Herald boss, which is what I would guess is a mini boss, possibly of some kind, as the devs state that Herald is the first big enemy that you'll encounter in the game, and that this gradual introduction to shipbuilding will allow players to become comfortable with using this shipyard system, where players can continue to fly on, unlocking new upgrades, places to explore, etc., before eventually moving on to more massive warships that both requires more experience to use and resources to build, which I'd imagine over time is still functionally very much subject to change, as the devs will probably continue to use active playtesting to get consistent feedback for each stage of the game itself. Either way, I think it's pretty cool to see actual sizing placeholder models for the first boss plan to be put in, because you have to think that if this guy is the first large enemy you will see in the game, God only knows how big these things might get, which I think would be really cool to see in future content or Skywatches that they might release. Keeping up the theme of enemies, the team's AI programmer Matt has been reshaping and formatting multiple different creatures within the game over the past few weeks, working on the cave creatures, which we have seen in past Skywatches, and apparently different variants, which they unfortunately don't show off this time around, which, in case you do remember, the Soldier Ant variants are able to dig under the ground and appear below the player's feet in order to attack. Additionally, Matt has been working on mantas, adjusting how they spawn and maneuver within a specific region. Between different islands, where they explain that, similar to Ellen's work, if this process is done correctly, the encounters between islands will feel realistic. However, if done wrong, it can quickly feel disengaging and break that feeling of immersion, in quotes. I'd imagine that part of the concern is when it comes to having to spawn mantas and open skies between islands, it's important to try and ensure that the players, especially in the early stages of the game, aren't too easily swarmed or overwhelmed. Another concern I'd imagine would likely be making sure that their spawn points and locations are correctly spaced out based on the player's max render distance, as well as ensuring that their combat against the players while they're actually riding their ships feels correct, and again, keeps that immersive feel. And saving the best for last, the devs reiterate that the next few months are going to be focused on the in-sky experience, in quotes, which includes actually building bosses to ensure that you have more exciting encounters in the skies, where they mentioned that John, the team's concept artist, has been working on some very sharp-looking modular shapes for heralds. They also mentioned that by utilizing these same bodies with different legs, heads, and other pieces, they can quickly create a sense of continuity within the enemies while still adding differences in the actual visuals for those bosses. This method will allow them to reduce development costs and potential time spent on creating brand new models for each variation, which they state is crucial for an indie game studio like theirs, where devs give 2 arrays of different modular parts and pieces for the different seraphs, which I think is safe to assume that that's the official name for these large beings, the seraphs, with small notes on the sides of the images that just point out the different lettered pieces that are for either tails, bodies, fins, heads, and other objects, all of which are very unique and alien looking. Now, the coolest and last image I'm going to show you is one of white box assets that were created by John, the team's 3D artist. They state that once these go through playtesting and they validate the experience in the encounters, they will get refined and textured. And just to quickly clarify, since we've mentioned the terms gray box models and white box models in the past, white box models in this case are effectively an extension of past gray box model stages, where for the most part it only means that the models have a lot more added detail, and in some cases parts of certain design aspects that are planned to be in the final model. And even though in this image the models are mostly blackened out, we are able to see some of the cool red glowy bits that seem to represent more of the quote-unquote technological aspects of these different seraph design things. And while I do have to say that these models look really awesome, it does once again make it even harder to deduce what some of these story directives are in this game. As we talked about before in the past Skywatches, we know that many of the different technological tools that the players will use in Lost Skies are Gaul in nature, and that many of even the Saborian tech in the dev's own notes state that Saborian tech is to be clasping Gaul tech, which gave the indication that in some way the Saborians were, in different methods, building their own devices around the Gaul's machines that already existed. Now we have additionally seen that the Gaul were the ones who created the Ark lifeboats that the devs say were made to save humanity from the Great Cataclysm. The question now remains to be what group is behind the cause of these Seraphs and recently added enemy drones. Are they somehow connected in some way? Is the Gaul civilization even human? And what relation do they have to these monsters? So for now, I think until future updates of the upcoming regions, and if the devs continue to share any small pieces of information about how these different beings and groups are actually connected in any way, possibly from more information about whatever society existed in the second region, we will simply have to wait and see. The last interesting thing I do want to point out again though, before I end this one off, the devs mentioned before that they are making a big delivery to their partners over at Humble Games. And while I have literally zero basis for saying this pretty much, it's important to remember that Humble is the devs' official publisher of their game, which when I hear that, it just screams potential trailer, maybe public post coming soon, in which case it might be interesting to you to know that. I do remember quite a while back that in one of the Skywatches there was a lot of talk about eventually pushing out an official gameplay trailer for the game, and while I'm not going to keep my expectations too crazy high because I know development is an up and down process, it's certainly not linear straight line incline at all, but something could be coming, so keep an eye out for it. Maybe that might be helpful to you. Either way, I hope the devs update was interesting to you. I know it certainly was to me and gets me super pumped for what they have in the near future regarding skyships and airship battles against these bosses, but unfortunately that is all I have for you guys. So like always, stay healthy, don't die if you can help it, and have a beautiful rest of your day, boys. Peace.